Hello, my name's Harold Hafton, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it would be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we'll be traveling to Mesoamerican and recreating a Ballcourt from the ancient Ballcourt game. While doing so, we'll talk about the Ballcourts, how ancient rubber balls were made, and the game's ritual connection to human sacrifice. This ball game had different names by the different Mesoamerican cultures depending on whether the name was from classical Mayan or the Aztecs. It's sometimes called Poctepok, which a Danish archaeologist adapted from the Yucatec Mayan word. In Spanish, it's called Juego de Pelota Maya, or in other words, Maya ball game, or simply Maya ball. Anyways, this game had many different variants, and the rules seem to have changed, as you might expect, over time from one culture to another. But at its root, the game, from what archaeologists can determine, can be dated all the way back to at least 1650 BC, which is when the earliest Ballcourts have been dated, although some think it might date even earlier, going back to prior to 2000 BC. What's really amazing about this is that the Mesoamerican ball game is still played in areas and places even today, which means that this game has in one form or another been played for over 4,000 years, and that modern version is called Ulama. Geographically, the popularity of this game was far-reaching, and Ballcourts have been found all the way from modern Central American countries like Costa Rica and Nicaragua in the south, all the way up through Central America and the Caribbean to northern Mexico and even into portions of what's now Arizona in the United States. I mentioned that there were a number of different variants of the Mesoamerican ball game, and some of these variants seem to have been played using wooden batons or out in a field of some kind, like modern field hockey, but the variation of the game that we'll focus on in this video will be the kind that's centered on the ball court. And just to put the quantity of these ball courts in perspective, there have been over 1,300 ball courts found, and they range in size from the largest, which is the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza, which was 96 by 30 meters, or 317 feet by 98 feet, to much smaller ones, such as at Tikal, which appear to be for ceremonial purposes, which was just 16 meters by 5 meters, or 52 feet by 16 feet. The ball court I'm building here today isn't an exact reproduction of a specific ball court. However, I did base it heavily on the ball court at Tz'Unun, Belize. Generally speaking, ball courts in earlier eras contained an alley flanked on each side by two parallel mounds. The version I'm building here is a later type, which is a ball court that has additional features, such as a capital I shape, which has some potential symbolism that I'll talk about a bit later in this video. That's right, dropping a little foreshadowing. As well as a ring on either side of the alleyway for each team to try and hit the ball through. Once I finish the build, at the end, I'll do a quick walkthrough and point out some of the items from the Tz'Unun ball court that I incorporated into my build here, and where I deviated from that specific ball court to incorporate other features that specific ball court didn't possess, to give a general flavor of ball courts as a whole. Well, the exact rules for how the game was played aren't entirely known. Based on the traditions of what was passed down and largely still used today, the game was between two teams, often with 2 to 4 individuals on each side, and played on a rectangular-shaped ball court that sometimes in later phases contained a smaller perpendicular rectangle at each end, so viewed from above it would look like a capital I, as I mentioned. The ball was around 25 to 30 centimeters, or around 10 to 12 inches in diameter, and around 1.5 to around 2.7 kilometers, or 3 to 6 pounds, and would be hit by one of the teams to another. If the ball bounced more than once before being returned to the opposite team, points were subtracted from the team's score, and if a team was able to hit the ball through the circular stone ring, that team would automatically win. And that's that stone ring I talked about before. From accounts of Spanish explorers who witnessed the game being played, they said that hitting the ball through the ring was rare, and normally the loser was the side that couldn't return the ball to the opponent, or if the ball was hit outside of the court. In a way, it worked kind of like netless volleyball, or perhaps volleyball, if you've ever played that. Volleyball, if you haven't, is a type of volleyball that's played in a racquetball court where you can hit the ball off the wall as it goes over the net. As you can see from my recreation as I'm building it here, the ball court had a long, narrow playing surface, as I mentioned, called an alley, and that was typically around 6 meters or 20 feet wide, and flanked on either side with a small wall, sometimes which was slanted, with a raised area on either side of the alley called a bench. The width of the bench varied from court to court, as did the width of the alley, but ran to the outer walls, which were usually sloped up the side of the outer mound, though sometimes it was more or less vertical. So much the same way as I was describing with volleyball or volleyball played on racquetball court, the rubber ball would bounce off the wall or outer slope as the ball would travel up and down the long and narrow alleyway, being passed from one team member to another and then over to the other team. Here's the interesting bit though. Unlike volleyball, where you can hit the ball back and forth using your hands to bump, set, or spike the ball, in this Mesoamerican ball court game, you could only hit the ball with your hips. Although there were variants, like this manuscript, which I'll pop up on the screen, which portray an Aztec game where players were using bats and batons to hit the ball on that same iconic capital I-shaped ball court. There are other variants of the game where the ball was smaller and hit with the hands or the forearms, but as I said before, it appears that the most common variant was the kind that you could only use your hips. Archaeological evidence and written records have shown many examples of protective gear worn by the players to protect their hips while playing the game, as well as a stone yoke, although it's not really clear how that stone yoke was used. Keep in mind what I mentioned earlier about the rubber ball, which is around 25 to 30 centimeters or 10 to 12 inches, which was roughly around 1.5 to close to 3 kilograms or 3 to 6 pounds. So this isn't a light rubber bouncy ball like you might play when you're playing dodgeball or kickball that's hollow and just has a rubber surface on the outside with air on the inside. This was a heavy, solid rubber ball, the size of a bowling ball. Historical accounts from the Spanish contain numerous mentions of individuals playing the game who would get hit in the head and die, or have their face split open, or the ball hitting players in the abdomen who perish due to internal damage and bleeding or ruptured intestine. Players of the modern ball game have also been killed occasionally, and their hips are reported to be in a state of being perpetually bruised through hitting the ball with their hips. Speaking of those rubber balls, it's easy for us to forget, but rubber is a natural product made from the latex of plants. How ancient people figured out how to harness and produce this rubber is truly astounding. Some of these rubber-producing plants are rubber trees, while others are grasses or small bushes. One type that's commonly found in the tropical areas was Castelia elastica, which is a large leafy tree that can grow up to 25 meters or 80 feet tall. The bark is scored using a diagonal channel that would allow the latex to well up from the freshly scored area, and because of the diagonal channel, it would allow the latex to flow down that channel where it would be collected in a vessel or in a small collection pit dug at the base of the tree trunk. There were also accounts of individuals collecting the latex with their hands and then smearing it on their skin where it was allowed to dry, and then it could be peeled off in sheets. In other areas that were not tropical, like in the arid zones of northern Mexico, there were no rubber trees, but instead they collected latex from a small bush. This bush had to be completely pulled up, including its roots, washed and then ground up, and then the latex rubber particles separated by filtration and flotation techniques. When fresh, the latex is thick and white, and as it's exposed to air, it changes color from white to gray and then ultimately to a blackish color, and it becomes thicker and starts to coagulate on account of the chemical reaction to the air. This process is aided by heating the latex and adding certain other plants that have a higher acidic pH, as well as enzymes and bacteria from those plants. This process allows for the liquid portions and solid components of the latex to separate, and what remains are soft strips of rubber that can be stretched and have taken on the elastic properties that we're used to seeing with rubber, where it deforms and then returns to its shape. Beyond balls being created for use in playing the actual game, there's also a lot of balls that have been found as offering balls in ceremonial and ritualistic settings. I think many of us who have been around little kids when they first see a bouncy rubber ball and watch it bounce and careen around a room know how amazed they are by that experience. The ball seems to bounce around and defy the laws of gravity and nature. In the same way, many historical writings from the Spanish who first saw the bouncing of these rubber balls in the game were likewise amazed. In the old world, where the Spanish came from, there was no material like rubber. Balls were made of cloth or leather, and they didn't really bounce, or at least not with the elasticity of those that were created using rubber in the ball game. Imagine if you threw a sock at a wall that you wound up into a ball. Yes, it's a ball shape, but it's not really going to bounce. To ancient peoples, that made these rubber balls special, and as such a gift from the gods. There was also a connection with how the ball was made that had ritual connections to life, fertility, death, and rebirth. To create the ball, you had to score the tree, collect the white oozing liquid, like it was white blood bleeding from the tree, and then it coagulated like blood. And even over time, it took on a dark black color. It was almost as if the rubber tree was giving up part of its life essence and bleeding to make that miracle material of the rubber ball. In fact, the Mayan word for rubber and ball are the same, which is ki'ik, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong. The Mayan word for the ball used in the game was called quick, which is another Mayan term for blood, which again, I'm sure I mispronounced that as well. So it's clear that there were strong connections between the game, rituals, and blood. Archaeologists have also found that at least for part of the Ballcourts' history, the losing players or team were ritually sacrificed by decapitation at the conclusion of the games, and have found representations of balls superimposed over the ball players' skulls in artwork. And some have even suggested that the shape of the Ballcourt itself, with its shape as a capital I, might be linked with that of a headless body. Clearly, playing the Ballcourt game, as I mentioned previously, could be dangerous and potentially life-threatening just by playing the game because of the weight of the balls bouncing around. But with the losing players losing their life at the end, the consequences of winning and losing were at a whole nother level. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the fact that there are differing opinions about the human sacrifices as it relates to these games. While some articles I read described the situation in the sensational way I did, and there are Mesoamerican myths that back up that interpretation. However, I also found some experts that feel that the stories about human sacrifice are not entirely accurate. Some point out that it just didn't make sense to kill the players on the losing team. So perhaps if there was human sacrifice, maybe enemy prisoners of war were the ones actually sacrificed. Other scholars point out that as popular as these games were, if the losing team always or even often lost their life, it couldn't possibly have been as popular a game because who would ever want to play it? Okay, let me give you a little bit of a tour here about the Tz'Unun site that I based this off of. So the color scheme here I based not necessarily off the site. I'm not sure what color it was, but I did base it off in the field notes, the written up site, the site notes. I based it off that where it actually said what was stucco and what was stone. And then these people standing all around here obviously don't at the site know where people stood exactly, but I did base it off some ceramic pottery that showed where people stood on site. The site at Tz'Unun didn't have this iconic eye shape. It was just the two mounds, so the mound on the right and the left, and then the one in the middle. Nor did it seem to have these here rings. And so I added those based on just images of other sites like Chichen Itza and other locations that had those. So yeah, so this is the build. So kind of half based on a real actual site, and then half based on other pictures. Well, that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I put a few links to various articles I came across while researching this video, so if you want to learn more, you might want to check them out. If you aren't in the mood to read some academic articles, I also put a link to a pretty cool website from the FIFA Museum that goes into the history of the Mesoamerican Ballcourt games and how they were played. Make sure you take the time, if you like the video, to like, subscribe, and all that stuff. And if you want to see more videos about ancient cultures, please click on these links here. Thanks. Have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.